1967, a Korean Taekwondo master walked into Bruce Lee's school with a single challenge: prove your kicks are faster than mine. What happened next lasted less than 3 minutes. No shouting, no brawl. Just one demonstration that ended a man's certainty and created a story that would be retold in martial arts schools for the next 50 years. This is what the witnesses say they saw. The Kune sat between a laundromat and a printing shop on Wilshire Boulevard, unmarked except for a small sign in the window that read, Jun Fan Gung Fu Institute. If you didn't know it was there, you would walk past it. That was intentional. Bruce Lee didn't advertise. He didn't need to. By 1967, his name moved through martial arts circles the way rumors do, quietly, but with weight. Students came because someone they trusted told them to come. They stayed because what they saw inside didn't match what they had been taught anywhere else. The space was narrow. Hardwood floors, mirrors along one wall, a few heavy bags hanging from reinforced beams. No trophies, no photographs of Lee posing with celebrities, though by then, he had already worked on the Green Hornet and had begun making a name beyond the martial arts community. Inside this room, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was whether you could move efficiently, adapt quickly, and eliminate what didn't work. Lee taught in t-shirts and loose pants. He spoke in short, direct sentences. He didn't lecture. He demonstrated, then watched you attempt it, then corrected the single thing that was costing you speed or power. His students weren't trained to perform. They were trained to function. Most of them were serious practitioners, men who had already spent years in other systems and had come to Lee because something about traditional forms had stopped making sense to them. They had heard that Lee discarded techniques that looked good but failed under pressure. They had heard he sparred without pulling punches. They had heard he believed in street applicability over dojo etiquette. What they found when they arrived was all of that, and something quieter, a man who tested everything. Lee didn't accept principles on authority. If a technique was traditional, that didn't make it valid. If a movement was written in a centuries-old manual, that didn't mean it worked against a resisting opponent. He broke down every strike, every footwork pattern, every block, and asked the same question: does this give me an advantage, or does it give my opponent time? His students learned to ask the same question. On this particular afternoon, the usual rhythm was in place. A few students worked the bags. 2 others practiced chai sao, sticky hands drills, in the corner, testing each other's structure and reaction speed. Lee moved between them, observing, correcting a stance here, adjusting an angle there. The atmosphere was focused but not tense. This was repetition. This was refinement. Then the door opened. A man stepped inside, older than most of the students. Mid-40s, perhaps. He wore a traditional dobok, white, crisp, with a black belt tied precisely at the waist. His posture was formal. His expression was calm. But there was something deliberate in the way he scanned the room, as if he were assessing what kind of place this actually was. One of the students near the door glanced at Lee. Lee nodded slightly, and the student approached the man, asked if he needed help. The man's answer was polite but clear. He was here to see Bruce Lee. The training didn't stop, but the energy in the room shifted. Students continued their drills, but their awareness had split. They were still moving, still practicing, but they were also listening. Lee walked over. He didn't rush. He wiped his hands on a towel, draped it over his shoulder, and approached the man with the same calm he used when greeting any visitor. The 2 men stood a few feet apart. The conversation that followed was quiet, too quiet for most of the students to hear. But the body language told them enough. This was not a student asking to enroll. This was a challenge. His name was Jun Ri, not the famous one. This was a different man, a master from a different school, though the confusion would later add to the story's mythology. What mattered was not his name, but what he represented: traditional Taekwondo, refined in Korea, taught with discipline, and built on the belief that Korean kicking techniques were the fastest and most powerful in the martial arts world. He had heard about Bruce Lee. Everyone in the Los Angeles martial arts community had. Lee's name came up in conversations about speed, about unorthodox methods, about a Chinese instructor who trained Chinese students, and didn't seem to care about the old boundaries between styles. Some spoke of him with admiration, others with skepticism. This man had come with the latter. He explained himself carefully. His English was accented but clear. He had been teaching Taekwondo for over 20 years. He had earned his rank in Seoul. He had watched Lee's television appearances and had heard the claims about footwork, about interception, about kicks that were faster than anything in traditional systems. He did not say Lee was lying. He said he wanted to see for himself. Lee listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change. He didn't smile. He didn't bristle. He simply stood there, arms folded loosely, waiting for the man to finish. When the silence stretched long enough to indicate the man was done speaking, Lee asked one question. "What do you want to do?" The man's answer was immediate. He wanted to test kicks, specifically side kicks, speed and power. He believed that Taekwondo's methodology, its chamber, its hip rotation, its decades of refinement, produced the fastest kicks in martial arts. He had come to see if Lee's method could match it. It wasn't phrased as an insult, but it didn't need to be. The implication was clear. Lee's reputation might be inflated. His system might be effective against untrained opponents, but against a master of a traditional art, the outcome would be different. The man wasn't here to fight. He was here to measure. By now the students had stopped pretending to train. They stood near the walls, near the bags, watching. A few exchanged glances. None of them spoke. This was Lee's school. This was his decision. Lee nodded slowly, as if considering the request. Then he walked toward the center of the room, gestured for the man to follow. The two of them stood several feet apart, facing the same direction, as if preparing for a demonstration rather than a confrontation. Lee's tone remained even. "You want to compare side kicks?" "Yes." "You go first." The man adjusted his stance. His shoulders squared. His breathing deepened slightly, the way a trained martial artist does before executing a technique they have performed 10,000 times. The students could see the preparation, the subtle shift in weight, the tightening of the core, the focus narrowing. Then he kicked. It was clean. Fast. The snap of the dobok was audible. His leg extended fully, his foot chambered and released with precision. The technique was textbook. His balance was perfect. He returned to his stance without hesitation, his expression unchanged. No one in the room could deny that it was an excellent kick. The speed was real. The form was traditional, yes, but that didn't make it slow. This was a master demonstrating what a lifetime of practice produced. The man turned slightly to look at Lee. Not smugly, not challengingly, just waiting. Lee stepped forward. He didn't stretch. He didn't take a deep breath. He didn't adjust his stance or settle his weight. He simply stood there, relaxed, as if he were about to point at something across the room. Then he moved. Lee's kick came from stillness. There was no chamber, no visible preparation, no pulling back of the leg to generate momentum the way the Taekwondo Master had done. One moment, Lee was standing in a neutral position. The next, his foot was extended, fully locked, at head height. Then it was back. The sound in the room was different. Not louder, sharper. The snap of fabric was faster, almost blurred. And then there was silence again. The students didn't react immediately. They were still processing what they had seen, or more accurately, what they had almost missed. A few of them glanced at each other, trying to confirm that they had witnessed the same thing. The kick had landed and retracted in what felt like a single motion. The Taekwondo Master's face remained neutral, but something in his posture changed. His weight shifted slightly. His eyes stayed on Lee, but the quality of his gaze had altered. It was no longer the look of someone measuring an opponent. It was the look of someone recalculating. Lee didn't speak. He returned to a neutral stance, hands relaxed at his sides, and waited. The message was clear. That was one. There would be more if needed. The master reset himself. He took a breath, longer this time, and prepared for his second kick. His form was identical to the first. His execution was just as clean. The technique was still sharp, still fast, still the product of decades of disciplined repetition. If anything, he had adjusted slightly, putting more snap into the retraction, more focus into the speed. It was an excellent kick, but Lee's second kick was faster. This time, The difference was undeniable. A student standing near the mirror would later say he saw Lee's kick in the reflection before he registered it with his own eyes. Another would describe it as if Lee had removed steps from the technique, not shortcuts, but unnecessary movements that other systems hadn't thought to eliminate. The master did not ask to go again, but Lee waited, and after a few seconds the man nodded slightly. A third attempt, one more measure. The master's third kick was the best of the three. He had committed fully now. No longer conserving energy or testing the waters. This was his technique, refined and delivered with the kind of precision that comes only from mastery. The chamber was tight. The extension was explosive. The retraction was instant. It was the kick of a man who had spent his entire adult life perfecting a single motion. And Lee's third kick was still faster. The room was silent, not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of conclusion. There was nothing left to test. The comparison had been made 3 times. The result was consistent. The master stood still for a moment, his gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance. Then he exhaled slowly, bowed his head a fraction of an inch, and turned toward the door. He didn't speak. He didn't offer an explanation or request a rematch. He didn't challenge the result or question the method. He simply walked to the door, paused briefly with his hand on the frame, and left. Lee watched him go. Then he turned back to the students, picked up the towel he had set down earlier, and draped it over his shoulder. "Back to work," he said. The students hesitated for only a second. Then they returned to the bags, to their drills, to their partner work. The training resumed. The rhythm of the room returned. But no one forgot what they had just seen. Lee moved between them again, correcting stances, adjusting angles, as if the last 10 minutes had been nothing more than a brief interruption. But the air in the Kune had changed. Something had been proven. Not with violence, not with argument, with 3 kicks. What the students remembered most wasn't the speed itself. It was the lack of effort. The Taekwondo Master had moved like a man executing a technique. Lee had moved like a man pointing at something. The difference was subtle but absolute. One required setup. The other simply happened. In the days that followed, the students would try to replicate what they had seen. They would stand in front of the mirrors, attempting to eliminate the chamber, to reduce the telegraphing, to find the efficiency that Lee had demonstrated. Most of them failed. A few got close. But none of them could make it look effortless. Lee had explained it before, in different contexts, during regular training. He called it the longest weapon to the nearest target. He didn't believe in pulling a technique back to make it stronger. He believed in starting from where you already were and moving directly to where you needed to be. No winding up, no cocking back, just extension. He had told them that traditional martial arts often added movements that looked impressive but cost time. The chamber in a side kick, pulling the knee up high before thrusting the foot out, created power, yes, but it also created warning. An opponent with fast eyes could see it coming, and in a real encounter, seeing it coming meant countering it, evading it, or simply hitting you first. Lee's method removed the warning. His kicks came from a fighting stance that already had his weight loaded. His hips were already positioned. His rear leg was already coiled, not obviously, but structurally. When he kicked, he wasn't preparing to kick. He was already kicking. The motion began and ended in the time it took most fighters to decide whether to kick at all. The Taekwondo Master had seen this firsthand, and what made the encounter so definitive wasn't that Lee's kick was faster once. It was that it was faster every single time. Consistency erased doubt. The first kick could have been luck. The second kick proved it wasn't. The third kick made it fact. One of the students, a man named Dan Inosanto, who would go on to become one of Lee's closest training partners, later said that what struck him most wasn't the demonstration itself. It was Lee's demeanor afterward. There was no gloating, no triumph, no explanation offered to the room about why his method worked. Lee simply went back to teaching as if nothing significant had occurred. But Inosanto also noticed something else. After the Taekwondo Master left, Lee spent the next 20 minutes working with a student on footwork, not kicking, not flashy techniques, Just small adjustments in how the student shifted weight from his rear leg to his front, how he positioned his hips to allow for faster rotation, how he kept his hands in a position that didn't interfere with his own mechanics. It was as if Lee had already moved past the encounter. The demonstration had answered a question. Now there was more work to do. The students, however, couldn't move past it as easily. They had just watched their instructor dismantle a challenge from a traditional master without raising his voice, without breaking a sweat, without even appearing to try. And the most unsettling part for them, and they suspected for the master, was that Lee had made it look inevitable. Not difficult, not dramatic, just inevitable. The master had walked in believing his system was faster. He had walked out knowing it wasn't. And the reason he left without arguing, without requesting a sparring match, without attempting to reframe the encounter, was because there was nothing to argue about. The kicks had spoken 3 times, and Lee had said almost nothing. The students waited for Lee to address what had happened. He didn't. He moved through the rest of the session the way he always did, focused, precise, present. He corrected a student's elbow position during a punch. He demonstrated a trap from close range, showing how a smaller rotation of the wrist created more control than a larger, more obvious grab. He worked the heavy bag himself for several minutes, drilling the same combination over and over, not because he hadn't perfected it, but because perfection required maintenance. No one asked him about the Taekwondo Master. Not during class. Not after. There was an unspoken understanding in the Kune. Lee didn't entertain questions that fed ego. He didn't discuss victories. He discussed problems, mechanical problems, tactical problems, problems of timing and distance. If you wanted to know why something worked, he would show you. But if you wanted him to celebrate that it had worked, you were in the wrong place. Still, the students talked among themselves after they left. In parking lots. Over coffee. On phone calls later that night. They replayed the encounter in their minds, compared notes on what they had seen, tried to articulate what had made it so definitive. Some of them focused on the speed. Others focused on the lack of preparation. A few noticed that Lee's kicks had landed at the exact same height each time, head level, no variation. No drop in precision despite the repetition. It suggested that speed hadn't compromised control. If anything, the speed had been a byproduct of control. But what stayed with them most wasn't technical. It was psychological. They had watched a man walk into the school with certainty and walk out with something else. Not anger. Not resentment. Just quiet recalibration. The kind of silence that follows a miscalculation you can't argue your way out of. The master had not been humiliated. Lee hadn't taunted him, hadn't mocked him, hadn't offered commentary on traditional systems or suggested that Taekwondo was inferior. He had simply demonstrated a faster kick 3 times, and then let the man leave with his dignity intact. That restraint mattered. If Lee had gloated, the story would have been different. It would have been about arrogance, about disrespect. The martial arts community would have remembered it as a clash of egos, and the lesson would have been lost in the noise. But because Lee said nothing, the lesson remained pure: speed without setup, efficiency without waste, proof without performance. One student later recalled that after everyone had left, he stayed behind to help Lee lock up the school. As they turned off the lights and checked the doors, he finally asked the question no one else had dared to ask during class. "Do you think he'll come back?" Lee paused, keys in hand, and looked at him for a moment. Then he shook his head. "No." "Why not?" Lee didn't answer immediately. He finished locking the door, tested the handle to make sure it was secure, and then said, very simply, because he got what he came for. The student didn't press further. He understood. The master hadn't come to fight. He had come to measure, and the measurement had been taken. There was no need for a second visit. The data was clear. What the student didn't ask, but thought about often in the years that followed, was whether the master had gone back to his own school and changed anything. Whether he had questioned his own methods. Whether he had begun eliminating the unnecessary movements, the telegraphing, the setup, or whether he had simply decided that some techniques, no matter how fast, couldn't be borrowed. that they had to be built from the ground up. That speed, like Lee's, wasn't a trick. It was a system, and systems took years to construct. By 1973, Bruce Lee was gone, a cerebral edema in Hong Kong, 32 years old. At the height of his fame, his films playing in theaters across the world, his philosophy beginning to take root in places far beyond martial arts schools. His death turned him into something larger than he had been in life, a symbol, an icon, a legend whose image would be printed on posters and quoted in books for decades. But in the years between 1967 and 1973, the people who trained with him carried stories. The encounter with the Taekwondo Master was one of them. It didn't make headlines. It wasn't filmed. There was no journalist present, no camera crew, no wide audience to witness it in real time. Just a handful of students in a narrow room on Wilshire Boulevard who happened to be there on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. But those students talked. And the people they talked to talked. And slowly, the story moved. It showed up in martial arts magazines, though often with details changed. Some versions claimed the master had been a Korean national champion. Others said he had challenged Lee to a full sparring match and been knocked out. A few said Lee had kicked so fast the man hadn't even seen it coming. None of those versions were accurate. But they spread anyway, because they fit the mythology people wanted to build around Bruce Lee. The lone fighter, the man who could defeat any challenger, the living embodiment of speed and precision. The students who had actually been there would hear these exaggerated accounts and quietly correct them when asked. No, there was no knockout. No, it wasn't a fight. No, the master wasn't trying to hurt Lee. It was just a demonstration. 3 kicks. That's all, but even the corrected version carried weight, because what mattered wasn't the drama, it was the certainty. In dojos across Los Angeles, then across California, then across the country, instructors would reference the encounter when talking about efficiency, about eliminating wasted motion, about the difference between looking fast and being fast. Some of them had trained with Lee. Others had only heard the story secondhand, but they all understood the lesson it contained. Traditional forms had value. Discipline had value. Repetition had value. But if those things led you to believe that your method was unquestionable, that your system couldn't be improved, that your techniques were already optimal, then you had stopped learning. And the moment you stopped learning, someone like Bruce Lee would show you what you'd missed. The story became a parable. Not about Bruce Lee's superiority, not about Taekwondo's weakness, but about the danger of assumption, about the cost of certainty, about what happens when you walk into a room believing you already know the answer. By the time Lee's films reached global audiences, The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Enter the Dragon, the general public knew him as an action star. They saw the high kicks, the nunchaku, the fights choreographed for maximum visual impact. They didn't know about the small school on Wilshire Boulevard. They didn't know about the hours spent refining a single punch. They didn't know about the quiet encounters that never made it to film. But the martial arts community knew. They passed the stories down, teacher to student, school to school, generation to generation, and decades later, in a dojo in Tokyo, or a gym in Sao Paulo, or a training hall in Berlin, an instructor would tell a new student about the time a Taekwondo master challenged Bruce Lee to test kicks. 3 kicks, no shouting, no brawl. Just a quiet demonstration that lasted less than 3 minutes and proved a point that didn't need to be argued. The student would ask, "What happened after?" And the instructor would say, "The master left." Lee went back to teaching, and 50 years later, we're still talking about it. Not because it was violent, because it was definitive.